Hello, I'm Dr. Ryan Anderson. I'm one of the founders of Telos U, and this webinar is about the 80-20 principle, which is an important piece of the Telos Processing Approach, which was developed here at Telos. Now, when we're talking about the processing approach, again, it was designed to help work with some of the challenges that come up when people have information processing issues. Of course, these same challenges can come up for anyone when they're under enough stress or being overstimulated sufficiently. But there are various ways in which those information processing issues tend to show that they're being experienced by the person. The person can become emotionally or mentally rigid. So they're stuck, they're frustrated, they're seeing things in black and white. They can show a great deal of stress sensitivity. They can demonstrate that they're having a hard time understanding either tasks or people or relationships, so they kind of come across as not getting it. They may be disorganized. They tend to have social struggles, and a lot of times they have difficulties with changes and transitions. And all of the things that we work on in the processing approach help to prevent these problems, but also are good for addressing these particular challenges when they come up. When we talk about the 80-20 principle, it is particularly useful with issues around rigidity, stress sensitivity, and difficulty with changes and transitions, although there are other circumstances under which it can be useful. But keep that in mind while we talk about things today, that this would be a principle that is very useful when we are encountering those kinds of symptoms. So while we begin thinking about the 80-20 principle, of course, it's a principle of compromise, but there are a lot of potential traps that come with the concept of compromise. And we want to think those through. First of all, anytime we are running into a situation where there's a task that needs to be done, and we find that we are running into the other person being rigid. They don't want to do it. They're not willing to change the way they're approaching it, and it's just not working. If we approach their rigidity with rigidity and all or nothing thinking of our own, that is not a good setup. In fact, that's a recipe for disaster. Rigidity plus rigidity equals escalation, crisis, apocalypse. And it's something we want to avoid. And the problem is sometimes we can get so stuck in our way of doing things that we're not willing to look where there is room for compromise or change or flexibility. And that can be the reason sometimes that things don't happen that otherwise could and should happen. The other side of that, the other extreme, is to simply cave and have no requirements, that we run into rigidity or resistance from the student, that we simply say, all right, well, we're just going to let them do what they're going to do. So that is not what we mean when we talk about rolling with resistance. And that is not what we mean when we talk about 80-20 compromise. So on the one hand, rigidity of our own, on the other hand, simply caving and not having any kind of expectation. Those are two things we want to avoid because both of those tend to contribute to the problem and are certainly not a part of any kind of solution. Now, as we go into the details, we need to keep in mind the basic underlying principles of the processing approach for all of its applications. And it's assumed that we are doing these things as we are trying to execute the strategies of the processing approach. If we are not doing these things, then very likely we're not going to have the kinds of outcomes from utilizing the processing approach, like the 80-20 principle, that we would want to see. First of all, we need to make sure that we have developed realistic understanding of the person and realistic expectations. So understanding is that we know who they are, what they're experiencing, the way things are for them. And our expectations should be realistic, both about what growth is going to look like for them and the speed at which they're going to grow. So it doesn't mean that we don't expect growth, but we make sure that we're aligning that with a realistic understanding of who they are and what they experience. From there, we want to start by building and enacting appropriate accommodations. We don't want to accommodate to the point where we are requiring nothing of the person and therefore kind of work them into a point of incompetence. But we do need to be aware that from where they are today with the struggles they're having and the outputs that they need to be able to deliver, there is a gap. And we need to start by helping them have some successes by working on accommodations that should diminish over time if we are using the scaffolding approach correctly. And if we're doing that, it helps to reduce stress for the person, which opens up their emotional space for trying and risking and growing. It helps to establish a supportive relationship between us and them, which is vital for all of our efforts. And it provides an appropriate way to guide us through the descaffolding process as they grow. And so as we're providing that appropriate accommodation, we also work with the student on building compensating skills and strategies and recognizing that they're going to have a learning curve with these. It's going to be slow and imperfect in the beginning. But of course, helping to teach them new skills and strategies works best when they have learned how to physiologically destimulate. So calm down their body, calm down their mind, and have some progress in general emotional regulation. So at any point in time, if we feel like we're using the processing approach techniques like the 80-20 principle and they don't seem to be working, it's always a good idea to come back and check and see how we're doing with these underlying foundational ideas. So the idea behind the 80-20 principle is pretty simple. We are going to look and see if there are ways that we can be flexible around certain aspects of the expectation around the task that would be sufficient to help the student get unstuck and feel like they can move forward. Now, I was a wilderness therapist for over 6 years, and I had a lot of experiences either with getting stuck in mud or snow myself or having other people do it. And one thing I learned is that when you get stuck in the mud, the worst thing you can do is just hold down the accelerator, because what that does is it takes you being a little bit stuck and tunnels you down deeper into the mud to where you are really, really stuck. But having more of a rocking back and forth motion allows you to get enough momentum to get unstuck. And when we're thinking about the 80-20 principle and the way that comes to 80-20 compromises, that's exactly what we're looking for. It's not that the task doesn't need to get done, but simply doubling down on the expectation tends to get things more stuck. But when we can find where we can rock a little, help the other person feel like they're getting more of what they need, then most of the time we're going to find that they are able to move forward and accomplish the thing that needed to be accomplished. But what we want to do is make sure we start with some kind of progress. We just want to start by getting unstuck. And to do that, we need to avoid all or nothing thinking, recognizing today they might be able to take 2 steps, tomorrow they might be able to take 3, and a week from now they might be able to take 5. And that's okay. We just need to embrace the idea of working on getting unstuck and having some kind of forward momentum. And what we want to make sure we're doing is we want to handle this in a way where we are not only maintaining our relationship with them, but we are building the relationship where they are feeling our empathy, our understanding, our willingness to figure out what their complications are and work with them on ways that really feel like they're addressing those. Because when we just double down with our rigidity, it hurts the relationship. And a really important thing we need to remember at all points in time is your relationship with the student is a bridge you are going to have to cross 1,000 times in the process of helping them grow into young adulthood. So as a result, you need to take very good care of that bridge. You need to be constantly building and maintaining it. Because if all we're doing is straining it and stressing it and burning it down, we have destroyed the very tool that we're going to need to be successful. So we need to approach that relationship with a great deal of thoughtfulness, and we should avoid anything that would try to get us to win the day by getting them to do the thing at the cost of the relationship. Now, when people say, well, where can I be flexible? Well, in different situations, it's going to be different things. But there are certain areas to explore. What you don't want to be flexible about are important principles or values, things that shouldn't be violated. But outside of that, there's actually usually a lot of room for flexibility around things like timing, when something needs to get done, sequence, what needs to get done first versus second or third, and how we might be able to change those around, the actual methods of accomplishing things, the amount of support. So it might be that when someone's needing to clean their room, At the end of the day, we'd like them to get to a point where they're doing it on their own. But in the beginning, they might be so overwhelmed that we need to be in there with them, helping them break it down, focus on specific small parts, and having specific, very, very concrete ways that we might be assisting, recognizing that over time will reduce that. So increasing support in the beginning can be an important piece. But again, they still need to have their own skin in the game. We're not going to just do things for them, but we can do things alongside them in the process of helping them learn to do things more independently. So as you are thinking about 80-20 compromises, the question you should find yourself not asking is, what can I do to get them to do X? Now, of course, that's often the question we're used to asking. And so often, when you break that down, when you listen to it, it sounds actually kind of coercive. How do I make them do the thing? But there are more useful questions for us to ask. For example, what do they need me to give them to help them do X? So not how can I make them do the thing, but what do they need from me that would make getting the thing done feel more possible, more like they're not losing by fulfilling it? You know, what would they need from me to help that feel more possible for them? And what would help them feel more capable, optimistic, or ready to do X, whatever that thing may be? So if we really focus more on those second two questions and really steer away from that first question, we're going to be guiding ourselves more and more towards what an 80-20 compromise should look like. Now, while you're going in to use the 80-20 principle, you're going to want to consider a couple of things. First of all, why are they stuck? Is it a matter of knowledge? And sometimes one of the things we really need to make sure that we're doing is they may not feel and understand for themselves why the thing matters, why it's important, why it has to be done. They've heard everyone else's reasons for caring about it. They've heard lots of lectures about why they should think it's important. But what we need to find is the common ground where something they value and the way they experience the world overlaps and naturally feels like a way to feel that the task itself is important, that the outcome is important. And that can't be something as simple as, hey, I'll pay you $50 to do it. You value money and therefore you'll value doing it. That will not last long. But there is something about the way this person experiences the world, the things they want, the hardships they experience, that if you help them find their path to caring about it, rather than sharing with them our path and telling them they should just adopt that, we're going to be much more successful. Now, they might be struggling because they actually lack the skills. They wouldn't know how to go about doing it, or they don't feel confident, or they've tried it before and they feel like they failed. So they may need to help on looking at how can I do this differently, or what's going to actually work to get more appropriate outcomes or more desired outcomes from this. It may be that they lack confidence for a variety of reasons, and that we need to help them build up by smaller successes to tackling something that they're actually feeling very intimidated by. And we also need to dive into understanding what their emotional drivers are, both towards wanting to do the task or the outcome, but also things that would make them not want to do it. It's important to recognize no one is completely unmotivated. Everyone is motivated to do something. And when people appear unmotivated, it's because they're running into another motivation that's leading them to a different set of actions. And so beginning to understand what these are and how we might help them navigate those competing motivational factors can be an important part. And again, what the 80-20 compromise can look like is a lot of things, but what we should not make it is you only need to do 80% of the things you actually need to do, and we'll just let all the other 20% slide. Rather, the 80-20 principle applies to each one of the different important tasks in their lives, of how we help them accomplish each one of those. But again, that supposes and requires that we've done a good job of building realistic understanding and expectation of what they are currently equipped to work on tackling. So to learn more about this, this also fits very well with a couple of other things, but we need to make sure that we're discerning very carefully in the situation from our point of view, because it's very easy for us to say, well, they need to do X, but actually they don't need to do it. It's what we want them to do. And that's a larger picture than what they actually need to do. So for us, as we approach these kinds of 80-20 principles and compromises with the students, there's a couple things we need to be very clear about with ourselves. One, what actually needs to happen in this situation versus what would be nice to have happen or what we would prefer to have happen. Because today they might only be able to do the part that they need. And what they think would be nice and what they prefer may be different than what it is for us. So let's work on that piece, because that can be actually the 80-20. What actually needs to be done? Actually just this piece. This other stuff, it'd be nice, it'd be taking things to the next level, but it's not actually the requirement. The second thing to discern is what is necessary right now versus what we are hoping to see for them in the long run. I've learned many times that we lose battles because we think they have to be won today, rather than letting them play out over time. So we can be very clear about what part of this really needs to be done today, and what parts do we hope they'll accomplish, and do we want to create a path towards accomplishing in the future as their competence, their knowledge, their skills, their confidence grows. Also, we need to discern what will make things easier for the student versus what would just make things easier for other people to be around the student. Now, hopefully over time as they grow, they will learn more and more pro-social skills and they will become quote unquote easier to be around. But we need to make sure what we're focusing on is what they are experiencing and what will help them feel like they are having a better experience, rather than the fact that their treatment needs to be about making them easier to deal with for other people. We need to discern how the student sees the situation versus the way other people see the situation. And again, whatever 80-20 compromise we make with them needs to fully embrace and fully work within their way of seeing things, their perspective. And we also need to discern between what the student values in that situation versus what other people value and what they might assume that the student should value. And again, whatever our 80-20 compromise is, it needs to fully embrace and work within what the student values, rather than it just being a capitulation to someone else's values and priorities. So keep in mind that if we're using the other aspects of the processing approach, we're more likely to have good success with the 80-20 principle. For example, if we're doing a really good job with forecasting and front loading, it helps. And in fact, some ways, if we're talking about what's going to come and we're discerning concerns that the student has, and we're working on the 80-20 principle before the point of action, what that does is it removes all of the emotional weight of, wait, now I've got to do the thing now. So good forecasting and front loading helps us strategically be able to do the 80-20 situation, the 80-20 approach, sooner, earlier, and avoid flooding issues by having to only do it in the moment where the task actually needs to be done. So again, all of the aspects of the processing approach work better if we're using them in concert with one another. It's also really important that you and the student develop clarity in what the task actually is. It's amazing how often what we think cleaning their room is versus the way they see it, or what we think paying attention in class is, or doing their homework is, or whatever the task may be. So one of the things we need to do is work together to create a shared definition of the task, because oftentimes they feel that we're being unclear or arbitrary, when really the issue is we've not created a shared definition. So together, and we don't just dictate this, we work with them to talk about what would the complete task look like, and make clear, concrete, well-defined goals. And while we do this, it's really important that we avoid baiting and switching, the idea where we tell them it's one thing, and once it's reached that, we immediately ask them, okay, now go a bit further. Now, over time, we might say, look, you've really mastered this. I think we're ready to take the next step. And again, we have that conversation and clearly define what the next goal is. But we do not do that while we're still in a task in progress, right? Otherwise, it feels like we're moving the goalposts. They feel like we're being arbitrary, and we end up getting a lot more resistance, and their buy-in to the task disappears. It also helps to look deeper and break it down. Sometimes the concerns that a student is having about a task or an outcome that needs to happen are not very clear. And so sometimes we have to dig deeper and understand they may be saying one thing, but there are more layers to what they're seeing and feeling that feel like obstacles to them. So sometimes it helps to break down that task into its various elements and explore with the student the different aspects of the task and kind of one by one check in about how confident or how worried, how bought in or how doubtful they are about each one of those pieces. And that helps us to zero in on what their actual concern is and where the actual support and 80-20 principle needs to be applied. And when you're doing that, you need to make it about resolving the concerns that they have about the issue, rather than trying to find some way to motivate, reward, or consequence them enough to just get them to do that specific outcome. So again, this fits well with some of the other principles that we're hoping that you're learning well with us. It would be a good idea, if you've not done them already, to go and look at the influence versus control webinar or the rolling with resistance webinar or both, and look at how the 80-20 principle fits with both of these guiding principles. So again, this is something that you'll find that as you do it, you get more done by exploring where you can actually have some flexibility rather than simply drawing lines in the sand and trying to push, incentivize, or consequence someone into doing things that need to get done.